Hello there, students. Welcome back. And today we are going to get into chapter 3 of your text, which is titled A Globally Connected Mexican Province. So we're now going to move into talking about specifically the Mexican period of California history. So the dates for that is 1821, when Mexico won its independence from Spain, to 1846, when the Mexican-American War begins. Okay, so here are our lecture questions for today. We're going to talk about who are the Californios. And I've mentioned the Californios before within the context of secularization. And the Californios are essentially just a group of Californians who are considered the elite class of Californians prior to the American period. And we're going to talk about some of their power and some of their culture today. The second lecture question today is, how does California change as a Mexican province? So we've talked about California as a Spanish province in which the mission system was a very important part. How does it change once it becomes a Mexican province? And then finally, how do foreigners impact California's history during the Mexican period? Because as we get into the Mexican period, we're going to see more and more contact with between California and the outside world. So let's talk about how that is going to change the course of California history. So here are your key terms for this chapter. And let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so we had talked in the past about how there's this distinction that was made in Spanish California between men of reason and men without reason, right? And the men of reason are the ones of some kind of European descent. And in terms of the Californios are not necessarily pure European. In fact, many of them are mestizos or mulatto, and they are very much racially mixed, but they are the Spanish-speaking elite of this frontier society in Alta California. And they are also going to be the inheritors of these massive tracts of land once the missions become secularized. So you're going to get these massive ranchos that will be owned by these Californios. Most of these Californios, by the time we get into the Mexican period, had been born in California. So they weren't really part of those migrations of colonists during the Spanish period. They might be descendants of those people, but they certainly are probably very much identify themselves as Californians. And they did carry on a lot of the Spanish traditions from the Spanish period, but they had a very distinctive California style to them, which I've already talked about a little bit when we talked about Spanish culture in California. And they're very similar in a lot of ways. But one of the important things to keep in mind is when you're talking about Californios in California history, they are really identifying themselves as Californians. They don't necessarily think of themselves as Spanish. They don't necessarily think of themselves as Mexican, even though California is a province, had been a Spanish colony, and once we get into the Mexican period, becomes a province of Mexico. Because of its isolation geographically, the people that are born and raised and living in California, they are speaking Spanish and they are carrying on Spanish traditions, but they think of themselves very distinctively as Californians. So the Californians actually become part of popular American culture in the early 20th century when a series of novels were written about the legend of Zorro. And Zorro was kind of this quintessential Californio figure, you know, that went around and carried out justice in this frontier Mexican California society. It was also a TV show, The Legend of Zorro. Okay, so we're going to begin our story of Mexican California by talking about the first Mexican governor of California, and that's Jose Maria Enchandia. And he will be sent from Mexico City specifically to govern this northern province of Mexico. This immediately is going to cause problems. And part of the reason is because he decides, sort of unilaterally, without really discussing it with anybody, that he is going to move the capital from Monterrey, which is where the capital had been during all of Spanish California, to San Diego. And he says he does this because he prefers the weather. But the problem with this is that it really upsets the balance of power and political influence in California. And so the norteños, the Northern Californians, start to be very upset by the fact that here comes this governor sent from Mexico City, right, in the wake of the Mexican revolution for independence from Spain. And he is immediately going to set to work, implementing new policies. And so he talks about a secularization plan for the missions. He begins to discuss with some of the Californios the land grants that they might get out of this secularization process. And again, a lot of what is happening is access to power. And because the Northern Californians were so used to having close access to the power center, it really throws them off that Enchandia has moved the capital down to San Diego. So it sets off this rivalry. It also starts this discussion in California, in the political and elite circles of California, as to whether or not Mexico should really have control over this province. California was very independent in terms of its economy. And so people started to discuss this idea. Do we really need to have Mexico as the center of power? Or can we have our own homegrown politicians? And that will ultimately end up being what happens. But Enchandia starts this rivalry off between the Norteños and the Sureños, right? The Northern Californians and the Southern Californians. And Enchandia is eventually sort of pushed out of his role as governor and replaced by Governor Victoria. And Manuel Victoria will take the governorship in 1830. And again, he's being sent from Mexico City, from this centralized government. Part of the issue when Victoria takes office is that Enchandia has already made all of these promises for land grants. And when Victoria takes office, he decides that he is going to null and void these promises for land grants. And this ultimately will lead to Southern Californians really hating Governor Victoria. And this is something that is, again, and so he moves the capital back to Monterrey. So ultimately, what's going to happen is an armed conflict. So this, as I mentioned, this rivalry between Northern and Southern California, which begins with Governor Enchandia, continues throughout the period of Governor Victoria. And the question was, who was going to have control of the customs house, right? So you have the goods that are coming into California from all of these places around the world. You've got European goods coming to California. You've got Hawaiian goods coming to California. You've got Asian goods coming to California. You've got Russian goods coming to California. You've got all these goods, right? And whoever has control of the customs house, which is where the taxes on these imported goods are paid, will have access to wealth. So that's part of the issue. But the other issue, of course, is that people who were closer to the capital had more political power. So the Southern Californians, in response to this power shift under Governor Victoria and the fact that he's now moved the capital back to Monterey, they decided to make a pronouncement. And they do the Pronunciamiento de San Diego. And this is basically a pronouncement that they are claiming independence, a declaration of independence of the Californios. And they present this on November 29th of 1831. What they wanted more than anything was for Governor Victoria to leave California, to be removed from his office. And Governor Victoria does not take lightly to this. And in fact, he decides that he is going to send an armed militia group and a posse with him at the lead down to Southern California to show these Californians who's boss. And this armed conflict is going to take place at Cahuenga Pass. The Sureños are going to claim the victory here because Governor Victoria will resign his governorship as a result of this armed conflict. And he also gets injured in this armed conflict as well. He gets a sword wound. So the Pronunciamiento of San Diego is really one of the important documents in early California, because what we see here is a real sense, by the fact that this document even existed, we know that the Californians were feeling very strongly about their independence, that they were starting to question whether or not the central authority should be in Mexico and not in California with homegrown Californian politicians, right? So that's why this pronunciation is very important in California history. It is the first sort of indication that the Californians themselves are feeling very much independently minded and separate from not just Spain, but also Mexico. Okay, so here's a picture of the Cahuenga Pass. I was trying to find the oldest picture I could possibly find. This is 1922. The Cahuenga Pass, in case you're unfamiliar with it, is where the 101 cuts over across the Hollywood Hills there into the San Fernando Valley. So it's a very old, area where people had traveled through, going all the way back to Spanish California and probably all the way back to the native people as they traveled back and forth up and down the state in their trading routes. And so the Cahuenga Pass is going to be the site of a couple of armed conflicts between the Sureños and the Norteños over this issue of who's going to have access to political power. Okay, so moving on, the Victoria is forced to resign, right? Because he's very unpopular and this armed conflict has now taken place. And so we're going to get a new governor, Governor Figueroa. And Jose Figueroa is going to basically take the lead when it comes to transforming the mission lands, secularizing the mission lands, taking the mission lands and then dividing them up mostly between all of the Californios. So we talked about this when we talked about secularization of the missions from a native perspective, right? So the natives were actually supposed to be part of this secularization plan, but instead they got gypped, essentially. They did not get the land that was promised to them. So many of them didn't even know that part of those mission lands were supposed to go to them. So at the time that this takes place, there's about 18,000 Native people living within the mission lands. And so they are forced out of the mission lands. There are three neophyte pueblos that emerge from this. They're all in Southern California. And this is where the most populated missions was in Southern California. So you have Las Flores, San Diego, and San Pascual. All of these were initially, when they were first founded, they were supposed to be mission Indian pueblos. In other words, here were former mission Indians who got kicked out of the missions because of secularization, and now they are given these very small plots of land for them to utilize and use and hopefully thrive and live and everything else. Now we know that actually what happened to a lot of mission Indians is that they never got these land grants, that they ended up going and working for the Californios on the big ranchos, maybe becoming homeless and just kind of wandering around the state doing odd jobs trying to figure out how to survive. Some of them tried to go back to their former lives living off of the land. That was very difficult to do by this point, and especially because more and more foreigners are now going to be coming to California. So by 1834, as you can see, 6 of those missions of the original 21 missions will be secularized, and the rest will soon follow. And this is really going to transform the power structure of California, because these former mission lands will be divided up amongst the Californios. Okay, so the Mexican government is essentially going to take hold of these former mission lands, and when they do this, the Californios sort of simultaneously begin to petition the Mexican government for these land grants, right? And some of them are getting massive ranchos. You're talking hundreds, sometimes thousands of acres of land were given out in these Mexican land grants. Many of the people that got the land grants were people who had either lived within the missions, worked within the missions, or sometimes also the presidios, the forts. And most of them already had some kind of knowledge of rancho life, right? How to ranch, how to raise herds of cattle, sheep, etc. Altogether, 700 Mexican land grants were issued to Californios and some naturalized Mexicans during the Mexican period. So who were these naturalized Mexicans? Well, people like John Sutter, who were coming. He came from America, but he was a Swiss-born American, and he had come to California. He arrives in California during the Mexican period, and gets this land grant from the Mexican government. So the Mexican government was also giving land grants out to foreigners. It wasn't just the Californios that were getting these land grants, because what they wanted was they wanted to encourage settlement up here in Alta California. And it was because of its geographic isolation, it was difficult to do that. So as long as the foreigners who were coming to California were willing to convert to Catholicism, they were willing to learn Spanish, they were basically willing to acculturate to Mexican culture, then they would be offered these land grants. A similar thing happened in Texas as well. So this was not just exclusive to California. So here we have a map of the Mexican land grants that were issued in the Mexican period of California history. So all of these areas here that are darkened, these were all areas that were divided up. Most of them former mission lands, but some of them not. Some of them just areas here in the Central Valley where you have very fertile soil. This, of course, was also where Sutter got his grant, and we're going to talk about Sutter when we talk about the gold rush. But anyway, so Sutter gets his land grant out here in the Central Valley, or what we also call the San Joaquin Valley. But you can see that most of the land grants given out by the Mexican government are along the coast of California. So you're talking beautiful, beautiful prime real estate, right? And so you can imagine that once the California becomes part of the United States, that a lot of these land grants are going to be challenged. And that's exactly what happens. So You'll notice that one of the issues here with the Mexican land grants, and this is what you're seeing is a typical Mexican land grant, and it's a basically a piece of paper. So this would be like a title to your land. And the way that they divided up the land was really by geographic markers, right? So you can see here, this particular land is being, you know, the boundaries of the land are essentially being denoted by these mountains, and these geographic markers. And so when the Americans come, they start to question the legitimacy of these land titles and land grants, because the Americans were used to having land grants that were very specifically surveyed, mathematically laid out, typically in 120 acre or 320 acre sections. And that's what the American government had been doing since the 1790s, is going out and surveying land in this sort of very mathematical way. And so when they come to California and the Americans take over California, they look at these land grants and they say, this is not a legitimate land grant. And so this sort of begins the problem with the Mexican land grants in California. Here you have another example, right, of, again, a Mexican land grant, but you can see it's not really mathematically surveyed. It is basically just a drawn map of the region where you see the boundaries are really being made by geographical features. You know, you see this river here, you see these mountain ranges, etc. Okay, so we talked about the Trans-Pacific fur trade and how important that was to the economy in Spanish California. As we get into Mexican California, the real like bulk and backbone of the Mexican Californian economy is going to be the hide and tallow trade. And this is going to come from the cattle and the big, massive ranchos that are going to exist in California as a result of these Mexican land grants. So plenty of meat, obviously, to eat in California because there was so much cattle. And it had to be eaten fresh because, of course, there was no refrigeration at this time. So meat could also be dried and salted, and it could be preserved in that way. But so there tended to be lots of meat, and nobody really went hungry, you know, because of that fact, because you had so many cattle. And these cattle were being slaughtered really not for their meat, but for their hide. And the hide, of course, was for leather and leather goods. And this was highly desirable, not just in California, of course, but all over the Pacific world. So people came from all over. Ships came from as far away as New England to collect the hide and the tallow, which is essentially the fat from the cattle that was often used to make wax and oil and for candles, and then also just oil itself for burning for heat or for light. And so this becomes a massive industry in California. And the indigenous population, the native people and the former Mission Indians, they became really the primary source of labor on these ranchos. And they would, you know, also process these hides, which it was very laborious to process these hides. They had to be, obviously, the hide itself had to be removed from the cattle, but then it had to be processed in a very particular way. So you would make these big pools of salt water from the ocean, and then the hides would soak in that for a certain period of time. And then they would be laid out to dry, and they would be cleaned, and then they would be carried onto the boats. And you can see here this artist rendering, but it's very accurate of the way that it was done. You know, the hides would be stacked up, and then they would have to be carried out to these skiffs these little boats, and then these skiffs would then take all of these hides to the bigger boats, which were anchored offshore. So it was really quite a long process, very time consuming, but it did really create the backbone of the economy in Mexican California. So you can see here, these are the different brands from the missions. So each of the missions had their own brand that they used for their cattle when they were, operating as missions and as industries during the Spanish period. And then as we start to get into the Mexican period, the ranchos themselves would have their own brands. And of course, these brands are made out of an iron, and they would be seared into the side of the livestock. So for example, the cattle would, if you were on the Lopez Ranch, you would have a particular symbol, and that symbol would then be seared into the side of the cattle. Now, early California was a free range society, meaning that the cattle were not fenced in. And so this led to twice a year, typically, and sometimes more, these massive cattle roundups, right? Where you had the caballeros, the cowboys that would go out and round up the cattle and then bring them to these rodeos. And then the rodeos were like these massive events in early California history where the cowboys could show off their horsemanship, and their special ways in which they lassoed the cattle. And so one of the videos that I'm posting for this week is actually a demonstration of one of the what was called the figure eight lasso, which was something that the Californios became very well known for because they were so good at it. And anyway, so this was not just a job in many ways, but it was also part of the society, because these big cattle roundups and the rodeos, they created the basis of entertainment and culture in many ways in early California. Okay, so there had been so many problems, right, with these governors in early Mexican California that really Californios were very much relieved when Juan Bautista Alvarado becomes the governor of California. He is actually the longest serving governor of Mexican California. He will take over from Figueroa in 1836, and then he holds office until 1842. He was a native Californian. He had been born in Monterey. He felt very strongly about his Californian identity. He opposed the centralist rule in Mexico. He felt like California really needed to have its own identity, and if not its own independence, but maybe even perhaps to join the United States. Alvarado was one of these sort of very independently thinking Californio. He was one of the few Californios that was literate. He had a library. He talked about changing the name of California to Montezuma because he felt so strong. He felt a very strong identity with the Aztec roots and the indigenous roots of the people of California. And he will also oversee this big transition in California from the mission lands, being part of the church, the Catholic Church. He will oversee it be turned into private lands. So he is a big, huge influence, actually, in California history. Unfortunately, he probably would have remained governor, and maybe even all the way until the outbreak of the Mexican-American War. But he went kind of crazy towards the end of his life. He became a very a severe alcoholic. And so he really kind of got pushed out of office because he became ineffective. But he was a big figure in that he represented this transition in California from governors that were coming from the outside um, to governors that were coming from within California. And so we're going to see that after Alvarado, there's going to be more native born California governors. So, one of the hugest things to recognize, and something that I talked about also with Spanish California, are the environmental changes that are coming with all of this activity that's taking place in California. So, the overgrazing and the worn soil from the cattle, right? The introduction of non-native plants, which tended to choke out a lot of the native plants that we have here in California. One of the biggest transformations was actually the grasslands. So we often see in California, these big rolling hills, and then if it rains, they turn green and they've got this grass on it. Well, that's European grass. That actually is not native California grass. Native California grass actually grew in bunches and was very hardy and endured really intense heat and drought and things like that, which is what our state experiences on a regular basis. So that's just one example of how a non-native plant had basically taken over the lands in California and driven out the native species. Of course, you're also going to have the disruption of animal life. Not only are you going to have hunting being a big thing, right? So you've got the grizzly bears who were hunted mainly, primarily just for sport, also sometimes for protection. People were scared of the grizzlies and they wanted them eliminated from the landscape. And so you've got that. But then at the same time, you've also got, the hunting of deer, a hunting of mountain lion, which kill the deer. So there was also this strange kind of proliferation of certain animals. So as people began to kind of destroy these, the top predators, like the grizzlies, like the mountain lions, at the same time, you're going to get some of these smaller animals, like the deers, that are going to start to grow in numbers. So it's kind of this strange trade-off. You also get, of course, the sea animals that are going to be hugely impacted by the presence of people. And most, of course, is the otter, the Pacific otter, which they actually thought by the time we got to the 20th century, the early 20th century, most people thought that the otters were totally extinct. And it wasn't until sometime in the mid 20th century that a tiny, small family of otters, sea otters, was found off of the coast of California. And since then, they've been a protected species, and their numbers have grown quite significantly. But again, just an example of how in such a short period of time, these massive environmental changes can take place. You also have water diversion, which is a huge thing in California, even to this day. You need to divert water for agriculture here. You also need to divert water for drinking. And so you've got water diversions that are going to begin with the zanjas, the aqueducts in the Mexican and Spanish period. And then, of course, those projects are going to grow significantly in size over the course of the American period with the building of the Los Angeles Aqueduct and the California Aqueduct and the Colorado River Aqueduct and all of these big infrastructures that we see today. So one of the hugest things that happens to the state during the Mexican period is this influx of foreigners into California. Certainly by the 1830s, foreigners were very well aware of California, its existence. There were written accounts of California You've got, for example, Richard Henry Dana's 2 years before the mast, where he talks about coming to California on these hide and tallow ships from the United States. You've got people, foreigners living in California, American, European foreigners, many of them men that had married into California families. They married Californianas. Many of them spoke Spanish and they had really sort of acculturated themselves, but they write back, to the United States, or they write back to Europe, telling stories of California. And people are becoming more and more fascinated with the idea of California, the possibility of California, the potential that it holds economically and otherwise. So you're starting to see these foreigners come. You have these Yankee Clipper ships, which were a very common sight off of the coast of California. And the Yankees, of course, are the Americans. That's what they called the Americans. And they're coming and they are engaging in this triangular trade that exists, right, between California, Hawaii, Canton, China, right? And it's basically so lucrative. It's very similar to what the Spanish did, when they first settled in California. But now you've got other groups coming to engage in this trade. And once California became part of Mexico, that was no longer illegal, right? Under the Spanish crown, technically it was illegal for the Californians to trade with anything other than a Spanish ship. But here, you've got this whole new market that is going to open up. By the time we get into the 1840s, people are starting to come to California through overland routes. Okay, so the primary way to get to California, really the most efficient way to get to California prior to the overland routes was by ship. But once you start to get these mountain men and people forging these new routes into California overland, again, more people are going to begin to arrive. And California gains a reputation, as I mentioned, and you start to get these written accounts, and people continue to come to California out of curiosity. Also, keep in mind that the Mexican government was not trying to stop people from coming to California, as I mentioned already. There were naturalized Mexicans who were coming to California and they were becoming Mexican citizens because they wanted to get access to the land grants, like John Sutter. So California is kind of going to first be explored in terms of Americans in the interior by these mountain men. Right, you start to get these mountain men that looked very much like what these dudes look like here. I mean, this is an actual photograph, but you can see that they really sort of lived off of the land. They lived very similar to the way that Native people lived, and they often served as guides to other Americans who wanted to come to California in these overland routes. One of the most famous is Jedediah Smith, who in 1826 makes his way into California from the east and actually opens up multiple overland routes, including the route that is now Interstate 80 that goes over the Donner Pass, and other routes in Southern California across the Tehachapi Pass. And some of these routes had already been forged by the Spanish, and of course Native people had these routes as well that they were aware of. They always tried to take the path of least resistance, so you were always looking at the mountain range and trying to find where the lowest pass is so that you could get over it. But the overland routes also had their disadvantages. One was, of course, the Sierra Nevadas, which was a huge obstacle and basically impassable during the winter when there was snow. And then in the Southland, right here, we have, of course, the Banning Pass here that goes through our valley. This was a main route, but as we know, in the summer, you don't want to get stuck out here in the middle of the desert in a wagon train, right? That's not going to be good. So there were limitations to these overland routes, but certainly these mountain men, as they were referred to sort of collectively as a group, were starting to come in greater numbers as we get into the 1830s. Okay, so we're going to end today's lecture today talking about the Bear Flag Revolt. And this is really sort of the transition point. This happens about a month before the onset of the Mexican-American War. So as these foreigners are starting to come into California in greater and greater numbers, right, there's starting to be this sense amongst Californians that the Americans are wanting to come and take California, to integrate California into the United States. And the Californios were actually divided on this matter. Some of them thought that might not be a bad thing for California to become part of the United States. Others thought, no, we're better off either being independent or we're better off just staying with Mexico, and we don't really trust these foreigners. One of these foreigners that was making an appearance in California at this time was a man by the name of John C. Fremont. And he was sent, actually, to California to survey the land. He was a soldier. He was also a politician. He actually runs for president in 1856. He loses. But he is somebody who is a very prominent member of American political elite. You know, he's married to the daughter of a senator, etc. So he comes into California with this big expedition of Americans, and he initially is driven out of the state. He is asked to leave because the governor does not believe or trust like his intentions. But before he leaves, a group of his soldiers kind of breaks off from the rest of, they leave from Sutter's Fort. So Sutter's Fort, which is now in what is present day Sacramento, becomes kind of like the hub of American activity in Mexican California. And Sutter would put up, you know, all of these Americans that were coming in. He would host them, and he would, you know, provide shelter for them and food, and et cetera, et cetera. And so John C. Fremont and his group, his expedition, is hunkered down in Sutter's Fort, and a group of them decide that they are going to take matters into their own hand, and that they are essentially going to declare a California republic independent of Mexico. And they do this by marching into Mariano Vallejo's compound in Petaluma, California. Now, Mariano Vallejo is a very prominent Californian. He's a very proud man. He, you know, came from the same circles as Alvarado. He felt very strongly, actually, that California may benefit from becoming part of the United States. He owned tons of land in Rancho Petaluma, and so he is the Northern military commander. And as I said, he has this huge ranch, right, in Petaluma. So here come these group of Americans, and they march into his compound, his rancho. And this is in what is now modern day Sonoma. And Mariano, very much in the vein of the California, invites them into his home, you know, offers them wine, et cetera, until he realizes what their intention is. And their intention is to basically take over the town, his little compound and his rancho and everybody in it, put Mariano under arrest, and raise up the California flag. And this is known as the Bear Flag Revolt. And it happens on June 14th of 1846. So again, this is talking about sort of the lead up to this Bear Flag Revolt. You've got this group of Americans. They are invading Vallejo's Sonoma compound. They are kind of a rogue group. They've already stolen some horses, etc. They put Vallejo under arrest. They raise a homemade California Republic flag, of which our current state flag is modeled after. And eventually, they are going to form the basis of the California Battalion that will fight in the Mexican-American War. But the Mexican-American War has not yet broken out officially. But they are kind of, sensing that it is about to happen. So this is the flag that they raise over the Rancho in Sonoma, over Vallejo's ranch. And as you can see, it is very much sort of modeled after our state flag today. This is supposed to be a bear, even though it looks kind of like a pig in this flag. But so this is where the model for the California flag comes from, is from the Bear Flag Revolt. It flew for 1 month over the compound at Sonoma. Vallejo gets put under arrest and taken back to Sutter's Fort, where he contracts pneumonia. And 1 month later, the United States is at war with Mexico. And we're going to talk in much greater detail about the Mexican-American War in the upcoming lectures. But the one thing I really want to encourage you to do is I posted on the video links, the instructor video links, I posted episode 1 of Latino Americans. And I really encourage you to watch the section on California, and particularly the Bear Flag Revolt. I believe it's at minute 21. But if you have time, watch the whole thing, because it's a really, really good episode in a series that is really excellent as well. So the link for that is in the instructor video links that I have posted in this module. So I encourage you to do that. It will tell a little bit more detail about the story of the Bear Flag Revolt. All right, well, that's it for today. Have a good one, and I will see you on the next one.